28 Days Later came out 23 years ago, and 28 Years Later is the latest movie in the franchise to be released. There was a 28 Weeks Later, but Garland and Boyle have come out and said that they're basically ignoring that movie and that this new one is a follow-on from the first. Interesting move, right? With 28 Years Later probably being one of the most anticipated movies of the early part of the summer, I thought I'd compare it to its contrasting original and determine which one is better out of the two. I'll be comparing the story, the performances by the cast, the infected, the deeper meaning of both movies, and I'll also answer if the sequel even needed to be made. So let's get into it. Here is 28 Years Later versus 28 Days Later. This video is also going to contain spoilers, so you've been warned. The story and deeper meanings. When it came to the story and deeper meaning behind what we were being shown in both of these movies, I think it's safe to say that 28 Days Later takes this round. 28 Days Later not only introduced us to the rage virus, but it positioned the entire film of Cillian Murphy's character Jim evading the infected and us believing that they were the main villain of the movie, when in reality it was Major Henry West and humanity that were behind the walls of the mansion that were just as dangerous as what they were hiding from on the outside. It was executed in a really powerful way by having Major Henry West being this kind-hearted, soft-spoken person, but actually hosting this sinister, evil side behind his eyes where he wanted to enslave the women and use them as motivation to his men, and also use them as a way of repopulating the country. This first movie showed that in a mere 28 days after the country fell to its knees, the mindset and behavior of man can regress to a point that's just as bad as what the infected are. It also showed how rage was inside of all of us, with Jim mirroring the behavior of the infected right at the end of the movie when he killed the final soldier with the signature pressing of the eyes, and Selena not knowing if he was infected or not. It was a great way of showing that rage is there within all of us and it can be unleashed. I'd also say that the way that this story unfolded and gradually built and built, it followed traditional tropes of storytelling and upping the tension as time went on, building to this large crescendo, but it didn't feel predictable in the slightest. I liked the fact that the infected didn't dominate the screen time, but they were the catalyst to see what true evil human behavior can be like if the ability to act on those tendencies becomes available. When it comes to 28 Years Later, the story was completely different. However, it did push home a deeper message. One that wasn't as relatable as the first movie, but it was all about the idea of staying still and looking in the past, rather than focusing on progression and looking to move forward. This was used through Holy Island and the fact that even 30 years later, they were mourning the lives that they once lived. However, through the use of Spike, we saw that this new generation were the ones that were going to actually look to progress. Within this story, there were a few moments where I questioned why certain things were happening. For example, I wasn't really a big fan of the fact that Spike was basically traumatized after going to the mainland for the first time and almost being killed by an alpha. His father also warned him about the strange nature of the doctor, but then the next morning he woke up, took his mother off the island and was hunting for the doctor that he was told had hundreds of dead in front of him. It just didn't quite make sense because I didn't believe in the slightest that it was something that he would have done. I also didn't really buy the fact that he'd be able to protect his mother, and that plot armor kept happening as well. I thought the whole idea of having somebody that was ill in this post-apocalyptic world and there being nothing that could be done brought a sense of reality into the movie. But then, once Spike found out, having the doc basically kill Isla and then shed the skin off her face and have him put the skull at the top of Memento Mori, it just felt really abrupt and sudden. This movie didn't necessarily build like the first. I'd say it almost felt like a movie of 3/3, which didn't go against it. It just kind of felt like we had Spike off the island with his father, Spike off the island with his mother, and then the conclusion with him being with the doc. It didn't really feel like there was ever really a crescendo or a moment, and it didn't conclude with a bang. Taking all of this into consideration, I think the first movie's story was definitely the one to remember out of the both of them, and I think it had something more powerful to say than 28 Years Later. The Infected. I've actually seen The Infected getting a bit of stick in 28 Years Later because people are frustrated at the fact that they've become sentient, but I don't actually mind that. The virus evolved and it meant that we saw that the infected were now kind of community-based. They were almost thinking for themselves when it came to certain things like bathing, and some were even mating with each other. We also saw a hierarchical system coming into play with the grey-skinned ones at the bottom, the regular gaunt ones in the middle, and the alphas leading the way. The idea of this alpha was actually petrifying, and the signature move that it had of ripping the head off of its victim whilst keeping the spine attached was horrifying to watch. I'd also say that the regular infected resembled the originals. However, because it had been almost 30 years in the timeline, they were a lot skinnier and gaunt compared to 28 Days Later because they clearly hadn't eaten. When it comes to 28 Days Later, I thought the infected in this movie were delivered really well, to be fair. I feel like the 480p camera quality does make a difference to that, and I'd also say that the harsh cuts and camera movements added to it as well. But what I will say is I feel like we saw the infected be a lot more menacing in 28 Days. We actually saw them infecting people, whereas in 28 Years Later, I don't really feel like we saw a single person getting infected by the regular infected and walk away, if I'm remembering correctly. I know they were the soldiers, but they were killed. So even though the threat was there and the risk was too, we never really saw anybody actually being punished. The harsh, glowing, blood-red eyes was something that didn't feel as prominent in 28 Years Later either. That was a feature that really allowed the infected to feel haunting in the first movie. So by not having that be as prominent of a feature, it did make them lose something. Even things like the throwing up of the blood, the animalistic behaviors that they had, and just seeing them up close and personal, I really feel like it was lacking in the sequel. So even though 28 Years Later had different variations of infected, and even though the alpha was literally so menacing, I'm gonna have to give this round to the original movie because I just thought the infected were delivered in a much stronger way. I just remember more scenes with them, and the likes of the one with the priest right at the beginning is something that literally sits within my mind when I think of the movie. The performances. When it comes to the performances in both of these movies, honestly, they were all incredible. This is probably the closest round because in both features there wasn't a single actor that let the side down. In fact, maybe there was one. I feel like the first movie felt a bit more intimate in the sense that there were 5 main performers in Cillian Murphy, Naomi Harris, Brendan Gleeson, Christopher Eccleston, and Megan Burns. And in 28 Years, it was more of a star-studded cast with a larger ensemble, with Ralph Fiennes, Jodie Comer, and Aaron Taylor-Johnson, with Alfie Williams on the other end of the spectrum leading the way, which was really impressive. For me, 28 Days Later contains both the best and the worst performance in the entire franchise. You've got Christopher Eccleston's performance as Major Henry West, which was simply incredible and so haunting to bear witness to. But at the same time, you've also got Megan Burns as Hannah, which was a character that was performed in such a stale way, so she does kinda drag it down slightly. When it comes to which characters I was more invested in though, I think I was definitely more invested in the first movie, and I just felt that little bit more connected to them. Jodie Comer was probably the strongest performed character in the sequel, but even still, I didn't really feel that emotional when she died, and I also didn't feel that attached to her either. Plus, with characters having behaviors that just didn't feel quite believable, I'm gonna have to give this round to the original movie too. Did we need the sequel? Do we ever really need sequels is the question I'm gonna throw back. It wasn't necessarily needed, but I'm glad that the universe is being explored more. There are 2 more films that are on the horizon, and I am definitely looking forward to seeing what they have to offer. When comparing these 2 movies, I do think the original is far better than the sequel that we recently got, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the new one's a bad movie. It just doesn't quite have that powerful nature that the original did, and I think the way that the original was shot allowed it to feel of its time, and like the outbreak genuinely happened in 2002. It was a movie that just felt a bit more contained and like it had something to say, whereas this one didn't have as powerful of a message in the slightest. So for me, the original movie most definitely wins this battle. So, there you have it, 28 Years Later versus 28 Days Later. If you want to see a full breakdown of the movie, then check the videos below. I also did a video breaking down every kind of infected and answering how they evolved, so that's there too. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.